wrongful convictions, false confessions, false or misleading forensic evidence, and official misconduct. So these are some of the reasons. Sometimes there's, well, most of the time there's multiple reasons. Some of these overlap a lot. These are just some of the reasons that wrongful convictions do unfortunately happen. And then also types of crimes by Texas exonerees. So the biggest one is sexual assault and murder. So why do you think this might be the highest percentage of crimes that we've actually been able to prove innocence for? Yeah.
Because they have DNA evidence.
Exactly. So sexual assaults and murders are the ones most likely to have DNA evidence associated with it. That if that evidence was saved, then we can go back and actually test this and get to that proving innocence mark that's so high to get. So here are some Texas DNA exonerations by year. So this is kind of the best way to prove innocence is if you have DNA, you test it, and it doesn't match, then they likely didn't commit the rape or the murder or whatever the crime is. So these are the people, some of the people from each year. We're going to be looking specifically at James Woodard here. So he was exonerated in 2009, officially exonerated. Actually, the evidence had DNA testing in 2008, but it became official. He got the official pardon in 2009. So we're going to look at this case. So here's James Lee Woodard. So this happened in Dallas County. He was exonerated in 2008. He served 27 years for a crime he did not commit. 27 years. Accused of raping and murdering a woman. So we hear about these wrongful convictions, but again, not everybody hears kind of the details. How does this actually happen? Well, this is kind of the process I'm going to go through. So I'm going to go through James Woodard's entire case. I read, I think the trial transcripts was 773 pages. I read every single one of those pages. I really dug in to this case to kind of give you a detailed example of how this unfortunately can happen in Texas. Again, not saying it happens often. We don't really know how often it happens, but it does happen, right? Okay, so James Lee Woodard. So just a little bit about him. He grew up in Dallas. So he was born and grew up in Oak Cliff area. So he is local to this area. He was born to a single mom. His dad didn't have a lot to do in his life. His mom really struggled to take care of the two kids. It was him and his sister at the time, and she was a maid at a hotel locally at a Sheraton. And so it was just really hard for her to handle. And so James began to live with his grandparents when he was around 8 years old. And then the grandparents kind of gave him some structure that he needed. And then when the grandparents just became too elderly to really care for him anymore, he went back to his mom when she was working like 3 jobs and just couldn't really give him the structure he needed anymore. And so he began to kind of, in his 15, 16, 17-year-old years, take advantage of that. So stay out late, party some, but he didn't get in any real serious trouble. There were 3 more minor crimes that he committed during this time. So the first one, he was 17 years old, and him and a friend broke into an empty building just to see if they could, basically. Silly things, right? So that was his first crime. So it was a misdemeanor. He was given probation. His second crime was when he was also 17, and he stole a $50 watch from the Quadrangle in Dallas, and he was given 3 years in prison for stealing that $50 watch. And he served 13 months and got out on parole. So that was his second crime. His third crime is that one of his friends took a car from his uncle's car lot and was joyriding around. So it was a really nice car. The friend came and picked up James Woodard and said, "Hey, I just got this new car, let's go for a ride." James Woodard got in the car, and then turns out the friend had stolen the car, and James Woodard was convicted of the felony of stealing a car. And so At this time, he was given some prison time as well, but then he got out. But that did make him a felon, because that was a felony. And so those were the 3 crimes that James Lee Woodard had committed. So we have that as a criminal record that we can look at, and this will come up later. Okay, so let's look at this particular crime. So in October of 1979, James Lee Woodard met Beverly Ann Jones. So this was the victim in this case, Beverly Ann Jones, and they began dating. They began dating in October 1979. He had plans to marry her. They were very close. They saw each other all the time, and he says that they were very in love. On Christmas Day, 1980, so this is over a year later that they'd been dating, it was Christmas Day, so Beverly spent all day long with James at his parents' house, and even stayed over and slept at his parents' house. So she was kind of part of the family, you know, at this point. On December 26, 1980, James worked with his stepfather all day long while Beverly spent time with James's mother. So again, she was kind of part of the family by this point. On the evening of December 26, 1980, James and Beverly got some alone time and spent it at Mona Lisa Hotel on Valentine Street in Dallas. So they did get some alone time then on December 26th. And then on the morning of December 27th, then James drops Beverly off at Beverly's mom's house so that she could spend holiday time with her own family. Okay, so we're kind of following the timeline here, right? So it's the holiday season. Beverly first spends time with James' family, then they spend time alone, and then James takes Beverly over to her stepfather's house, or to her mom's house, so she could spend holiday time with her own family. And then on the night of December 27th, Beverly spends the night at her mother's house for the holidays. And then on December 28th, then Beverly's mother took her back to her stepfather's house, and then she was just going to spend time with him. Again, it's the holidays, we're trying to see, you know, as much family as we can, so there's kind of a lot of shuffling going around. But this Sunday, December 28th, is when Beverly's mother took her back to her stepfather's house, and that was the last time that she saw Beverly alive. So here's the map of Dallas here. So you can see where Beverly's stepfather's apartment was located. So again, we're in South Dallas, you know, around the Oak Cliff area still of South Dallas. So this is the last place that Beverly was seen alive, was when her mother dropped her off at her stepfather's house. Okay, then on December 29th, around midnight, so this is the, Beverly had dropped her off between 7:30, Beverly's mom had dropped her off between 7:30 and 8 p.m. on December 28th. So on December 29th, around midnight, Oscar comes home. He got off work. He was a welder in Dallas. He came home. He sees Beverly's stuff. It's in the living room. She kind of slept on the couch there when she came over. And so she saw her stuff was there, but didn't see her, and so just kind of was like, oh, she must be out. I'll just go to bed. So Oscar went to bed. And then the early morning hours that morning, then Oscar gets a knock at the door. This is around 3 in the morning, goes to the door. He says that somebody's looking for Beverly, and Oscar, the dad, is just like, I don't know where Beverly is, why are you waking me up, you know, and kind of slams the door in his face, and then goes back to bed and goes to sleep. And then the same time, around 3 in the morning, 2 of the neighbors at Oscar's apartment complex say that they hear screaming, and Daddy, Daddy, please help me. So they hear the screaming, Daddy, Daddy, please help me. One of the neighbors goes onto her balcony at 3 in the morning and kind of like looks down. She's on the 2nd floor, so looks down, tries to see what's going on. The neighbor says that they see a car that's a Buick Elantra 225, and then somebody screaming, Daddy, Daddy, please help me. And then there's a man that is taking her away, presumably Beverly. Okay, so this all happened in the early morning hours of December 29th, 1980. Then Oscar doesn't hear anything from Beverly. Nobody hears anything from Beverly. And then Beverly's body is found 2 days later on December 31st, 1980. so 2 days later, and it's found, the body's found. There were two people, David and Marguerite Sanders. David worked for the landfill of Dallas. He and Marguerite were driving down the road and kind of noticing all of the debris, that's being thrown all over the road. Since he works for the landfill, that makes him really upset. They were driving above like the Trinity River bottoms, and they're kind of looking at all the trash that's been thrown there. And then Marguerite says, wait, I think there's a body. I think I see a body there. And so they hope it's just a mannequin, but still they get off the road, they kind of drive down to that area, and then they see that there is a naked body. They just have knee highs on, and then that's it. And that a body that was obviously traumatized. So they immediately go and they call the police, obviously. This is the location where Beverly's body was found. So remember where she was last seen alive was around here. And then Beverly's body was found around right here. Okay, so the investigator comes out. Linda Fulgham is the detective in charge, homicide unit investigator. They look around. They see that there are fresh tire tracks that are leading straight to the body that were not from David and Marguerite. So they see the fresh tire tracks. The investigators are all taking pictures of everything around. They're taking pictures of the body. The unidentified body is taken to Parkland Hospital. Again, they didn't know who this was at the time. The medical examiner does his examination and says that the body has been brutally sexually assaulted, vaginally and anally, and has blunt force trauma to the whole body, and that the death was from actually strangulation. So that's how she actually died. But lots and lots of trauma to the body. Time of death is estimated to be the evening of December 29th, 1980. So again, this is after the neighbors heard the screams, so a few hours after that, and after the dad heard someone knocking at the door looking for Beverly. So this was just a few hours after all this happened that they estimate the time of the homicide to be. So then Oscar, he knows that he hasn't heard from his daughter in a couple of days, and the neighbors have told him, hey, we saw Beverly, screaming and trying to get, away from some man and saying, Daddy, help me. But Oscar, he says later that he just thought that that maybe she, needed to learn a lesson. She never liked James Woodard, and so if he was trying to harm her, that maybe that would be the wake-up call that she needed. That was kind of his explanation for not, being more worried or coming out. And so Oscar is driving down the road, and then he hears on the radio that they found an unidentified body, about 21 years old, female, and then it kind of clicks with Oscar, okay, I haven't seen Beverly in 2 days, this could be my daughter. And so Oscar calls the police, and then Oscar pretty much goes straight to Parkland Hospital and sees the body and says, yes, that is my daughter, that is Beverly Ann Jones. And so Oscar did identify the body, and then also called Beverly's mother. Beverly's mother also came to Parkland Hospital and identified the body as well. So then it's the morning of January 1st, 1981. So we haven't really heard, where James Woodard has been during this time, right? And so the morning of January 1st, his friend named Ruby all of a sudden runs into his house and says, Beverly's dead, Beverly's dead. And then he's like, what are you talking about? I just saw her a couple of days ago. And this is before cell phones, right? So, there's not any weird, I haven't texted them or whatever. And so he's like, I just saw her a couple of days ago. She was fine. Like, we spent the holidays together. And Ruby's like, no, everybody's saying Beverly is dead. And so James calls Oscar on the phone and says, hey, I'm hearing things about Beverly, is it true? And then Oscar just says no and slams down the phone because I think that he thinks that, James maybe had something to do with this, so he wouldn't talk to him. And then he calls her uncle, and then her uncle confirms, yes, she is dead. And so he's, He doesn't know what to do. He can't believe it. Later that day, on January 1st, so the police have been investigating this. They've talked to the neighbors, and the neighbors, tell police that they saw, her being taken away in a Buick Elantra 225. Guess what James Woodard drives? A Buick Elantra 225. And so, and Oscar is telling the police, I think it was James who did it. The neighbors also say, I saw the person that did it. The police show the neighbors a photo lineup, and then they identified James as the one who was taking Beverly in the car. So, police came to James's parents' house. He was at his parents' house at the time, and said, hey, we need to question you, in this. They don't accuse him of anything at the time. They just say, hey, we need to question you. So they have James get in his Buick Elantra 225 and follow them to the police station. So why do you think that they did that instead of just taking him themselves? Right, they wanted to investigate the car, right? So if they can get the car to the police station while they're questioning James, they can go through the car. They can investigate the tire tracks. They can see if there's any blood, if there's any kind of evidence in the car. And they're probably expecting to find, something like that. So that's the reason that they do this. So this is of the actual car, but it looks something like this. Buick Elantra 225. It was a black car with a white top, just like this one is. So this is James Woodard's car, as well as the car that the neighbors said that they saw Beverly being taken into. Okay, so on 10 p.m. on January 1st, 1980, James Lee Woodard was arrested and charged with the murder of 21-year-old Beverly Ann Jones. So he was arrested based on the testimony of Oscar and the testimony of the neighbors and the fact that he also had a Buick Elantra 225. Also, the investigators said that he didn't show enough emotion for when he was being questioned, that they thought he should be crying a lot more. And that was part of the reason why they thought he was guilty, that they said at trial. Okay, so this is James Lee Woodard. This was his mugshot when he was officially arrested at 27 years old for the rape and murder of Beverly Ann Jones, 21 years old. So this was in January 1981. This is the official Dallas County mugshot. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the trial. So again, like I said, I read the trial transcript was about 773 pages. I read every single word. This was actually for a book project that we were doing at UT Dallas under the direction of Dr. Anthony Champagne. You may recognize his name. He's the author of our Texas government book. And so I worked with him very closely on this project, and it was just to kind of look into details of how this can actually happen and kind of tell these stories in a lot more detail of what has been told before. So the state of Texas versus James Woodard. So I'm going to go through the trial. So you're going to hear all the evidence that the prosecution presented, all the evidence that the defense presented, and then you can decide for yourself, if you were on the jury, would you find him guilty or not guilty, okay? So be thinking about that yourselves. Put yourself in the jury's shoes here. So the trial begins on May 18th, 1981 in Dallas County. Okay, so first the jury hears the prosecution's case against James Woodard. So these are all the witnesses that were presented on behalf of the prosecution. So the first witness for the prosecution was Arthur Lou Edwards. She was the mother of the victim, so Beverly's mother. So this is, I have some of the actual words from the transcripts are in blue. So the prosecution, one of the first things that they do is put a picture of Beverly's dead body in the mother's face. So of course she breaks down, obviously, emotionally, very, very emotional, breaks down in tears in front of the jury. Said that she didn't like the kind of guy James Woodard was. Talked about how tumultuous the relationship was, that there was a lot of fighting. Said that after Beverly started dating James, that she had regular scars and marks on her neck, and kind of just painted him as just an abusive, no good boyfriend, basically. There was also a lot of, they never said it directly, although the prosecution did later, but there was a lot of kind of insinuating that James was her pimp and that he was like pimping out Beverly and Jones. There was a lot of, and then he got her into heroin. So they talked about like marks, all of a sudden we saw marks on her arms and you know, tracks on her arms and things like that. So just really painting this, it may be true, like, you know, I don't know. But really painting him as just this no good, abusive person. Okay, then the next person that the prosecution put forward is Oscar Edwards. So this is the father of the victim. Okay, so remember Oscar was the one who was at home. Someone came knocking at 3 in the morning. So Oscar is telling the jury this. So he said that he heard a knock on his door early morning hours around 3 a.m. and says absolutely 100% that person was James Lee Woodard. Tells the jury this. So here's kind of his actual words. I just opened the door and he was standing there and he asked if Beverly was here. And I said no, and sleep is mostly what I'm wanting now, so I didn't want a conversation with anybody. So I just said, no, she's not here. And there was no reason for me to give any more conversation because this is James. And I just closed the door and went back and crawled in the bed and didn't pay attention to anything else. Oscar testified that he didn't hear any screaming, but that the neighbors told him later. But he said, you know, look, I didn't hear any screaming, but I was in the back, you know, the apartment. It was away from the parking lot. So I probably wouldn't have heard any screaming anyway, basically. So he said, I didn't hear any screaming that I know of. There might have been, I just didn't pay any attention to it. He also testified that he thought that James Woodard was violent with Beverly at times. Again, nobody actually testified they saw him be violent with Beverly. So no one actually witnessed this. They just said that they thought he probably was. And so it was just that. Okay, then Joanne also testified, so this was the neighbor at the apartments. So Joanne, so this is from the trial transcript. So the prosecutor says at approximately 3:30 a.m., did you hear noises? Joanne says, yes, sir, screams. Prosecutor says, did you hear one scream? Joanne says, a bunch of screams. Soft or loud? They were real loud. What did you hear scream? I heard, Daddy, help me, please help me. Was that scream one time or was it screamed over and over again? It was over and over. What did you do when you heard those screams? I went outside to see what was happening. Did you know the person who was screaming? Yes. Who was it? Beverly. So she testified that she went out on her patio. So apparently she works early morning hours. She was a cook at Sears, I think. And she had already gotten up for her shift. She had already had her coffee. So she was saying that she was bright and alert. She went out on the patio. She heard the scream. She had to kind of duck down through the, you know, the patio bars to try to get a good look. But still says that she got a good look. So identified the car as belonging to James Lee Woodard. Said that I've seen him there a lot of times with Beverly since they dated. This was definitely his car. And also said that she was sure James Lee Woodard was the driver. And so the defense was even asking her, but it was dark outside. Like, how could you see? And she was like, nope, I could definitely see. I got on my hands and knees. There was a light that happened to be shining on them. It was definitely James Lee Woodard taking away Beverly and Jones as she was screaming. And so, again, she says, when the car was coming up, I was looking through the windshield and I got on my knees so I could see. I was wondering what was happening to her. They always did argue a lot. So again, he's kind of being painted over and over again as this abusive boyfriend, right? Okay, then Linda Fulgham, she's the main investigator from the homicide unit in Dallas County. So she gets up and she testifies and basically just says what she found at the crime scene and the time of the, kind of presents the evidence, kind of pictures of the crime scene and things like that. Says that they found tire tracks. However, none of the tire tracks matched James Lee Woodard's car. Also, they found nothing in the car whatsoever. There was no evidence at all of any kind of struggle or anything in the car from the Buick Elantra that James drove down. And then Dr. Arthur Copeland also testified at the stand for the prosecution and just saying, hey, I examined the body. this is what I found. She was, raped brutally and strangled, and estimated the time of death to be on December 29th. Again, a few hours after that, scuffle that the other witnesses said happened at the apartment complex. Okay? Okay, so that was all of the prosecution's case right there. So the prosecution painted James Lee Woodard as kind of this abusive boyfriend who had a rocky relationship with Beverly. The eyewitnesses saw the defendant, taking her as she's screaming for her daddy to help her. The dad, says, hey, he came to my door around that same time. It was definitely him. The neighbor says it's definitely him. So do you think that this is enough? If this is what you heard and you're on the jury, would you convict James Woodard? So just kind of think about that. Okay, so we haven't heard the defense's case yet. So let's hear the defense's case, and then we'll get kind of a show of hands of who might, if you were on the jury. Okay, so the defense case for James Woodard. So the first witness for the defendant was Lorena Hurd. So this is James's mother. Okay, so Lorena says that Beverly was like a daughter to her. Said that James left her house on Sunday evening. So this was after Beverly had already left. Left on December 29th, the night in question. And the defense says, do you know where he was going? And Lorena says, I sure do. He always tells me where he's going to go. He told me he was going to Arlington. And then Ruby Jewell, so Ruby, you may remember that name, was the person who first told James that Beverly was dead. So Ruby is actually an ex-girlfriend of James that he still kind of sees on the side. So, yes. So the alibi witness was actually his ex-girlfriend saying he was sleeping with me on the night in question. So it provides an alibi, but at the same time, does that help his character and the whole no good abusive boyfriend, characterization of the prosecution? Not a lot, right? And so Ruby Jewell is a witness. She's the alibi witness. So she said that she was with James Woodard all night on December 28th and December 29th, all the times in question here. So the defense says, did you stay there all night long? Ruby says, yes, I stayed there all night long and slept in his arms. The defense says, did Woodard stay there all night long with you? And Ruby says, yes, he did. My little cousin was on the phone all night, and she noticed that he didn't get up. He was in the same position. I was still in his arms the way we went to bed. And so this is his alibi. I couldn't have killed Beverly because I was with my ex-girlfriend that night, all night long. And so this is the defense that he has. I couldn't have been in both places at one time. So this all happened at Ruby's aunt's house in Arlington. So this is where Woodard says he was the night that Beverly was killed. So again, way over here, body was found about right here. So the prosecution is saying, even if you were here, there was still time for you to sneak out and, be over here for a couple of hours and then just go back. And then Ruby just didn't notice you were gone. So that's what the prosecution was trying to say. Then Johnny Fayes also comes to the witness stand for the defense. And this is her house. So this is Ruby's aunt. So they were staying at her house. Johnny Fayes had gone to a concert that night and then comes home, and James Woodard was still there, and says that that basically, yeah, he was there when I got home. I can't say for sure he didn't leave, but my bedroom is right next to where his car was parked. I think I probably would have heard his car, start up and pull away and then come back in if he had left. So I believe he was probably still there, that he probably stayed there the whole night, but she couldn't say 100%, whether he did or not. Okay, so then James Woodard actually comes to the stand. So James Lee Woodard was 28 years old at the time of the trial. He was the final witness for the defense. And so Woodard basically said the same thing that Ruby said. and that he was at her house, at Ruby's house all night in Arlington. There's no way I could have committed this crime. I couldn't be at 2 places at one time, right? And so the defense says, did you see Beverly Jones on the morning of Monday, December 29th? Woodard says, no, sir, I did not. Did you ever put her in your car and take her away from that apartment on Monday? No, sir, I didn't. Defense says, did you kill this girl? Woodard says, no, sir, I didn't. Defense says, had you had some fights in the past? Woodard said, yes, we had quarrels, verbal quarrels, but not physical quarrels. Defense says, have you ever harmed her physically? And Woodard says, no, sir. And then Woodard says, this is the way I feel in my heart. I never induced anyone to do anything wrong. There's something I didn't tell you about me. That is, the lady that you found dead was the woman I loved, and I was going to marry her. I went through much grief through her death and doing it while incarcerated. And then prosecution says, well, I don't see any grief on your face. Where is a tear for Beverly Jones? And Woodard says, I've cried out. And so then they asked him about, well, how did a neighbor see you taking Beverly into your car? And then he says that just didn't happen. And so the prosecution said, so Joanne lied about that. And Woodard says, yes. And then prosecution says she lied about it because she wants to get you. And Woodard says, I don't know why she lied. Maybe she's mistaken. I'm not going to call her a liar. And then prosecution says, and Oscar, he didn't see you there at 3 in the morning on December 29th. And Woodard says, no, he didn't. And prosecution says, because you weren't there? And Woodard says, no, sir. And prosecution says, and he's got to be mistaken, even though he's seen you dozens of times. And Woodard says, he's either mistaken or he's just. And the prosecution says, flat lying. And Woodard says, well, offering perjury testimony one or the other. So then prosecution says, why didn't he like you? And then Woodard says, sometimes maybe first impressions. There's a number of reasons why people don't like you. And the prosecution says, the reason he didn't like you is you were working Beverly Jones, weren't you? So this means like prostituting her, right? Woodard says, no, sir. Prosecution says, you were working her at Hall and Thomas. No, sir, I didn't put Beverly on Hall and Thomas. Isn't it a fact you were pimping for Beverly Jones? No, sir. Isn't it a fact she quit you and told you she wasn't going to have anything more to do with you on Saturday, December 27th? Woodard says, no, sir. Prosecution says, and isn't it a fact that you got mad at her and you went over there and found her that night and you took her out and you killed her? So they're painting a story about, what happened, right? And then Woodard says, no, sir. And so the defense rested after the testimony of James Lee Woodard. So that was all the evidence that the jury heard at the time, okay? So heard from the mother of Beverly, heard from the dad from Beverly, heard from the neighbor, heard about Beverly or James knocking at the door at 3 in the morning, heard from the neighbor that James was dragging her into his car at 3 in the morning, heard from the homicide investigator and from the medical examiner. And then on the defense side, heard from James's mother, heard from Ruby, the person he was with that night, heard from the aunt whose house they were at, and then also heard from James himself. So then they do closing statements. So the defense closing statement talks about that James Woodard was in Arlington, miles away. There's no